Anyone who really listens to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech understands that the civil rights leader was talking about the distant future of America. Those close to him knew that it was unlikely that they would bear witness to a nation united rather than divided by diversity. But King did expect his 4 little children to one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His oldest child, Yolanda, passed away in 2007. An activist to the end of her days, she departed from this world feeling as though her father's work continued to progress. But in her own words, "We've not reached the promised land. We're still wandering around, bumping into each other in the wilderness of ignorance and hate." Her younger brother, Martin Luther King III, however, has continued to push his father's purpose through 2 terms of the Trump administration. In 2018, he called the president's words regarding impoverished African nations as vulgar. And in 2025, he urged Trump to stop invoking the words of his father and to instead invoke the actions of the nonviolent civil rights activist. The King children have been forced to watch as diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have been stripped away from every level of the federal government, while numerous private sector entities have followed suit. The conversation lists 12 ways that the current administration has dismantled civil rights law in the first year of its second term. Professor Spencer Overton calls it a cumulative retreat from the federal government's role as an enforcer of civil rights law. Students of history will recognize that it was after the Crookshanks and Slaughterhouse cases that the federal government was forced to leave civil rights enforcement to the states, a decision that began the Jim Crow segregated era that the modern civil rights movement beneath Dr. King worked tirelessly to reverse. Of course, Dr. King wasn't the only civil rights activist seeking to overturn Jim Crow. Malcolm X saw the same problems, but offered radically different solutions. Whereas the nation saw triumph in King's march on Washington, Malcolm X called it a farce. King won over allies on Capitol Hill, resulting in a coalition that managed to pass the Voting Rights Act. For these efforts, X labeled him a political chump. As King sat in Birmingham jail as part of his coordinated nonviolence strategy, X stated for the record his unequivocal belief that there's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Every American state includes the civil rights movement within its stated curriculum. 37 of them specifically identify Martin Luther King as a required teaching point, but only 13 do the same for Malcolm X. And those that do reduce him to a foil, pitting him as the, quote, angry counterpart to Dr. King. The ABHM, America's Black Holocaust Museum, explains that the standard classroom narrative goes like this. King was peaceful, and Malcolm was violent. King had a hopeful dream about integration, while Malcolm hated white people. That's the story that I recall being fed when I was in high school in the 1990s. But students today have lived through the first African-American president, a man whose message of hope runs parallel to MLK's dream poster that remains affixed to many history teachers' classrooms around the world. But they have also lived through the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, a nonviolent organization that sought to reveal that Black lives are not as valued or protected as those of other racial groups, something that facts prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Students that embraced the movement had to watch as individuals countered with the slogan, "All Lives Matter," as a way of repudiating the movement, misunderstanding that BLM sought to elevate Black men and women to the point where they were included in their opposition slogan. Stanford linguistic analysts find that such a response is hurtful, dismissive, and cruel, telling their readers that if you still find yourself wanting to respond, "All lives matter," "White lives matter," or "Blue lives matter," ask yourself why "which lives matter" is a more important question to you than "do Black lives matter?" I have found that these students, particularly my African American students, are responding less to Dr. King, whose model of slow collective change hoped to one day transform America into the world of his dream. These same students, however, are listening more intently to the ideas and notions of Malcolm X, demanding change immediately, and being unwilling to turn the other cheek to the countless acts of racist microaggressions that continue to be a part of their daily lives. Last year, I was trying to find a movie for my students after the conclusion of the AP exam. I zeroed in on Spike Lee's 1992 Malcolm X, starring Denzel Washington as the title character. Although it's rated PG-13, my school attempts to discourage the showing of films during class time by requiring us to get approval for any movie. Seeing as how the movie wasn't rated R, I didn't expect to get any pushback to showing it to my predominantly African-American class. To my surprise, however, I was told to be very careful and make sure that I gave parents enough time to request an alternative assignment. That caused me to pause and reflect on what I might not be seeing. My assumption is that the administrators thought about quotes such as, "All white people are devils," and worried that I might be promoting a divisive, perhaps even toxic viewpoint rather than Dr. King's idealistic utopian dream. Yet that embraces the most shallow version of X's life and ideology. It also simplifies Dr. King into a great man, one whose missteps are erased. The bottom line is that both men are instrumental to the modern-day civil rights movement. Although they approached the problem from different angles, they gradually began to mirror each other. X softened, beginning to embrace white allies and emphasize peace above all else. MLK, on the other hand, hardened, growing angrier and angrier that incremental progress remained so difficult to obtain. Modern educational standards may pit the two men against each other, thus creating a divergent choice for their followers. But in reality, X and MLK were two sides of the same coin, great men who fought with every tool at their disposal to ensure that the content of one's character mattered more than the color of their skin. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon divergent moments within the African American community. Episode number 5, A Dream Deferred. If we are to understand why Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X appear to stand so far apart, we must first understand that they were born into two entirely different Americas, separated not simply by geography, but by experience, theology, violence, and expectation. Neither King nor Malcolm invented their worldview. They inherited it. Martin Luther King Sr. came from humble sharecropping origins, but the trajectory of his life changed when he managed to marry the daughter of the most successful black preacher in Atlanta. Jr. was born in 1929 into a household defined by stability, education, and organized resistance to segregation. His father, now Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., known as Daddy King, led Ebenezer Baptist Church and believed deeply in confronting racial injustice through institutional leadership. He openly challenged segregation in Atlanta, refusing to accept humiliating customs, once walking out of a shoe store with his young son after being told that they would have to move to the back for service. King later recalled this moment as formative. In his own words, he saw in his father a man who never adjusted himself to the system of segregation. The family refused to ride segregated buses, would not respond to the term boy, and demanded that police officers refer to Daddy King as Reverend King. His mother, Alberta Williams King, added another dimension in the form of education and musical discipline. The daughter of a prominent minister, she ensured that King grew up immersed in church life, scripture, and classical education. The King household emphasized dignity, composure, and intellectual achievement as tools of racial advancement. Even in childhood, King lived within a structured black institutional world. Churches, colleges, professional networks, all created by African Americans during Reconstruction precisely because exclusion demanded self-sufficiency. This doesn't mean that MLK's childhood was perfect. He recalled wanting to crawl under a rug upon realization that he was the only black man in the theater watching Gone with the Wind. On a school field trip, he and other black children were forced to stand for a 90-mile bus ride while white children sat. Initially best friends with a white boy, the two separated as their racial differences came to the forefront of their minds when they were just 6 years old. Still, compared to many African Americans in the Jim Crow South, MLK's childhood was nice. Upon finishing high school, he attended Morehouse College, the most prestigious historically black college in the nation. Malcolm X's childhood unfolded in almost the exact opposite environment. Malcolm Little was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925 to Earl and Louise Little, both devoted followers of Marcus Garvey and members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. Garvey's movement rejected integration entirely. Historian Penal Joseph notes that Malcolm grew up in a home that celebrated black pride, boldly proclaimed black dignity, and brandished political activism as practically a familiar birthright. Where the Kings maintained their dignity quietly, the Littles proclaimed it. There was nothing passive about Earl Little. He was a traveling organizer and preacher who promoted Garveyism from pulpits across the Midwest. Although his demands for immediate rights would later become associated with the teaching of W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey's vision for civil rights was inspired by the bootstrap racial uplift politics of Booker T. Washington. Although the North certainly wasn't the Jim Crow South, it wasn't always safe to preach black empowerment. Soon, his passionate commitment to racial justice triggered a backlash, resulting in the family fleeing from Nebraska after their home was torched. FBI files and local reporting from the period confirmed that Garveyite organizers were closely surveilled, viewed by authorities as politically dangerous. Short stints in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and East Chicago, Indiana were followed by the family settling down in Lansing, Michigan. Rather than learning from the experience, Earl Little doubled down in his demand for equality, preaching Garveyism to any and all that would listen. This type of activism once again made the Little family targets of white supremacist groups. In 1931, Earl Little was found dead beside streetcar tracks. Authorities ruled the death accidental, despite several injuries inconsistent with witnesses' accounts. Louise Little believed, and Malcolm would later insist, that the Black Legion, an offshoot of the KKK, murdered his father. The life insurance company refused payment, claiming suicide, plunging the family into the depths of poverty. The contrast with King's upbringing could not have been more sharper. King grew up watching a father who pushed back against segregation and survived. After Earl Little's death, the state intervened. Welfare authorities increasingly scrutinized Louise Little, eventually declaring her unable to care for her children. She was forcibly committed to a state mental institution in 1939, and the Little children were separated into foster homes. Malcolm was just 13 years old. Despite the odds stacked up against him, Malcolm excelled academically. At Mason Junior High School in Lansing, he was one of only a handful of black students, and often the only black student in advanced classes. School records and Malcolm's own recollections describe him as a straight-A student. He was articulate, popular among classmates, and elected president of the student body, an extraordinary achievement for a black student in a predominantly white Midwestern school during the 1930s. But Malcolm never felt as though he belonged. Joseph reveals that Earl's death hastened Malcolm's departure from a Michigan public school system he found to be incorrigibly racist. Malcolm recalled his time at Mason Junior High School as an abject lesson in racism, where white teachers referred to him by the N-word, and even friendly white students thought of him as little more than a mascot. For a brief moment, Malcolm believed merit might overcome race. He later wrote that he admired his white social studies teacher more than any other adult outside of his family. When the teacher asked students about their future ambitions, Malcolm confidently replied that he wanted to become a lawyer working on achieving civil rights. The response that he received reshaped his entire life. According to his own account, the teacher told him that law was no realistic goal for a Negro, advising him instead to pursue carpentry, a trade considered appropriate for black students regardless of their academic ability. What made the moment devastating was not the cruelty of it. Malcolm emphasized that the teacher spoke kindly, even sympathetically. They didn't understand that what they were saying was devastatingly racist. That kindness with which the teacher delivered their matter-of-fact pronouncement made the lesson unmistakable. The system did not require hatred to limit black ambition. It required only assumptions. Years later, Malcolm would describe this conversation as the point when his faith in integration collapsed. Excellence had not protected him. Popularity had not protected him. Achievement had not protected him. He promptly dropped out of school at age 15. While Malcolm encountered the limits of American possibility, Martin Luther King Jr. encountered expanding intellectual horizons. At Morehouse College, he was shielded by a network of black educators who, rather than discouraging ambition, expected leadership from him. A ladies' man from the very beginning, King spent college wining and dining with the daughters of Atlanta's black elite. His reputation threatened to catch up to him, even bestowing the nickname of the Wreckers upon him and his wingman. Hoping to study medicine and then law, it was at Morehouse that he became consumed by the growing intersection of race, religion, and justice. The murder of Maceo Snipes, the only black man in his county to successfully vote, wasn't perceived by King as an accident. Just 17 years old, Martin pierced the veil between the justification for lynching black men, an epidemic of violence at the time, proclaiming that we aren't eager to marry white girls and we would like to have our own girls left alone by both white thoughts and white aristocrats. The message echoed that of Alex Manly from the 1898 Wilmington coup. Of course, when Manly uttered such a thought, it led to an event that killed hundreds while cementing Jim Crow segregation throughout the South. King soon joined his father's church as an assistant pastor. The experience was so positive that he attended Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. There, he spent 3 years with 9 other black students in a class of 32. Joseph explains the importance of this experience, noting that King discovered, analyzed, and came to embrace the social gospel through reading the work of Walter Rauschenbusch, the theologian and author of Christianity and the Social Crisis. The social gospel interpreted Christ's teaching as a vehicle for social justice on earth, not just in heaven. It was also during this period that he intensely studied the works of Mahatma Gandhi and Karl Marx. Gandhi's ideas, called Truth Force, changed his mind regarding what it would take to defeat Jim Crow. Previously, MLK had hinted that nothing short of an armed revolt would do the trick. Now he saw a successful rights movement, one that could be adapted to the collective application of Jesus' love in order to inspire a social force so large that it couldn't be defeated. Unfortunately, the teachings of Dr. King often get reduced down to the simplest level. Rather than merely copying Gandhi, who had the good fortune of a world war providing him with substantial leverage over his oppressors, King combined truth force with the work of Reinhold Niebuhr's 1932 work, Moral Man and Immoral Society. The book would become his blueprint for the movement. The author identified power as the necessary adjunct to moral transformation. He judged nonviolent methods as more important for their ability to alter oppressive regimes than for their romantic interpretations. Above all was the notion that confronting evil required moral courage. Malcolm Little seemed to lack that moral courage. Having embraced injustice, he had come to live the life of a low-level criminal hustler. He came to age in New York City and Boston, learning to rely upon his natural intelligence, quick wit, and charisma. From the outside, life seemed delightful. Joseph writes that Malcolm dived into Boston's nightlife. He learned to drink liquor, smoke marijuana, and romance women. He shined shoes at Roseland State Ballroom, where he encountered some of the era's great jazz musicians, including Duke Ellington. He purchased a zoot suit with its large lapels, balloon pants, and wide-brimmed hat, and completed the look by styling his hair in the fashionable conch style of the 1940s, which straightened his hair with chemicals. Before he transformed into X, Malcolm Little had become Detroit Red. Red personified the black hipster archetype, young black men who lacked formal education, determined to find autonomy, freedom, and pleasure in urban cities against the backdrop of war, violence, and racial segregation. As Red, Malcolm rebelled against the conventions of black and white middle-class ambitions. He possessed neither the education nor the ambition to be allowed to enter into black respectability. The assumption by elites, repeatedly proven wrong by racial violence and Jim Crow, that racial progress could be steadily measured through black achievement. Such a perspective denied racism's uncanny power to shape black life and denigrate the poor, unlettered, and unemployed as the root of white people's racial animus. In Boston, Malcolm joined a generation of young black men who refused to work dead-end jobs and resisted military induction. Showcasing some of the innate qualities of a talented performer, he avoided being drafted in World War II by showing up to the medical examination and asking where he could find guns to steal in order to go kill some crackers. He was almost immediately declared mentally unfit to serve. We have no idea what military discipline and the experience of fighting for double victory in Europe would have had on Malcolm Little, but it absolutely would have changed the trajectory of his life. 2 years after inquiring military officials where he could find the guns, he was arrested for burglary. Cocaine had taken over his life. Rather than fighting the system, Malcolm copped a plea, turning in his entire crew for the promise of leniency. When it came out that he had regularly dated white women, he found himself sentenced for a period of 8 to 10 years for what ought to have been pleaded down to a misdemeanor. Intellectually, Malcolm was still a baby with an untapped mind waiting to be developed. Turning 21, but still not yet having to shave regularly, he was taken under the wing of John Elton Bembry. It was beneath his tutelage that Malcolm began to devour the books from the prison's modest library. Although he was learning all subjects, the breaking of baseball's color line by Jackie Robinson fascinated him more than any other. He became so obsessed with learning that he begged to be transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony, a facility that looked more like a college campus than a prison. Instead, he received orders to be moved to the Massachusetts Reformatory. It was there that he would encounter the Nation of Islam. the group's message appealed to the children of Earl Little. Independent of Malcolm's conversion, 3 of his brothers and sisters had joined the organization. Islam is a spin-off of Christianity, in the same way that Christianity emerged from Judaism. Still, the Nation of Islam was considered radical even among adherents of the Prophet Muhammad. That's because the Nation of Islam did not emerge from the traditional centers of the Muslim world, nor did it develop through the centuries-long theological debates that shaped Sunni and Shia Islam. Instead, it was born in the industrial cities of the American Midwest during the Great Migration, a religious movement created specifically to address the psychological and material conditions facing Black Americans in the early 20th century. The organization began in Detroit in 1930 under the leadership of a mysterious figure known as Wallace Fard Muhammad. Very little about this man's origins can be confirmed with certainty, a fact that contributed both to the movement's mystique and to skepticism from outsiders. What is clear from early Nation of Islam documents and member testimonies is that Fard preached a message radically different from both Christianity and Orthodox Islam. He taught that African Americans were not merely a racial group oppressed by history, but a lost nation whose true religion and identity had been stolen through slavery. Among his earliest followers was Elijah Poole, later renamed Elijah Muhammad, who would become the central architect of the Nation of Islam after Fard's disappearance in 1934. Elijah Muhammad organized the movement's teachings, combining elements of Islam, Black nationalism, dietary discipline, economic self-sufficiency, and strict moral codes into a comprehensive program for personal and collective transformation. What separated the Nation of Islam from mainstream Islamic traditions was not just theology, but purpose. Orthodox Islam emphasizes the universality of the Muslim community, the Ummah, transcending race and nationality. The Nation of Islam, by contrast, centered Black identity explicitly. It taught that Black people were the original people of the earth, and that white society represented a corrupt and oppressive deviation from divine order. Elijah Muhammad's teachings included cosmological narratives unfamiliar to traditional Muslims. Among the most controversial was the story of Yaqub, a scientist said to have created the white race thousands of years ago through a process of selective breeding, producing a people destined to rule through deception and violence. To outsiders, such teachings appeared fantastical. To many Black converts living through segregation, however, they functioned less as literal science and more as moral inversion, a theology that reversed centuries of racial hierarchy embedded in American Christianity. For generations, Black Americans had been taught through distorted religious interpretations, namely that slavery was divinely sanctioned and obedience virtuous. The Nation of Islam offered the opposite message. Blackness was sacred, discipline was liberation, and separation, not integration, was the path to dignity. Equally important was structure. Members were forbidden from alcohol, drugs, gambling, and extramarital sex. They adopted new names, rejecting surnames inherited from slaveholders and replacing them with an X, symbolizing the unknown African name stolen by slavery. The movement established businesses, schools, and farms, emphasizing economic independence alongside spiritual renewal. In the urban North, where many Black migrants found themselves trapped in poverty despite escaping Southern segregation, this message proved powerful. The Nation of Islam did not ask America for acceptance. It promised self-respect without permission. It was into this ideological world that Malcolm Little was introduced while serving a prison sentence in Massachusetts. By the late 1940s, Malcolm had earned the nickname Satan among inmates for his hostility towards religion and authority. Prison records and Malcolm's own recollections describe a man driven by rage, intellectual curiosity, and restless energy. His turning point began not with a preacher, but with letters from his brothers and sisters, particularly his brother Reginald, who urged him to stop smoking, stop eating pork, and open his mind to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. At first, Malcolm resisted, but prison provided something he had never possessed before: uninterrupted time to read and think. In the autobiography of Malcolm X, he describes copying entire pages of the dictionary by hand to rebuild his vocabulary, reading history, philosophy, and religion late into the night under corridor lights after official hours ended. The Nation of Islam's teachings gave him coherence to experiences that had previously felt random. The racism he encountered as a child, the destruction of his family, the rejection by his teacher, the violence of the streets, all were explained not as personal failures, but as symptoms of a global system of oppression. For Malcolm, the message was intellectually electrifying. For the Nation of Islam, Malcolm represented something equally valuable. Elijah Muhammad recognized in Malcolm's letters an extraordinary mind, disciplined, articulate, and intensely devoted once convinced of a cause. Prison ministers noted his transformation from combative inmate to focused student. Fellow prisoners began gathering around him to listen as he explained Nation of Islam's teachings with clarity and passion. He would later write that accepting the teachings felt like awakening from a long sleep. He stopped using drugs, embraced strict self-discipline, and began to see education as a form of liberation. The movement gave him language, purpose, and identity. He, in turn, possessed the charisma and intellectual force capable of spreading its message far beyond prison walls. When Malcolm left prison in 1952, he no longer was Malcolm Little. He truly was Malcolm X, with the X representing both a stolen past and a chosen future. Neither he nor the Nation of Islam yet understood how transformative that partnership would become, or how profoundly it would reshape the national conversation about race, religion, and power in America. Courage is often found in prison. The last time I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., I claimed that his version of nonviolence required intense courage. Rather than flower power, the nonviolence that came to represent the modern-day civil rights movement was one that expected a great deal of violence. This was still the Jim Crow South. Lynchings were still occurring on a regular basis. King graduated from theology school in 1951. Emmett Till was just a 10-year-old boy living his best life in Chicago at that point. His sadistic, violent murder in Mississippi wouldn't occur for another 4 years. King's nonviolent vision was one-sided. He intuitively grasped the power of the media. Opinions would change if they saw black men, women, and children being violently assaulted by whites, particularly white cops empowered to serve and protect. Malcolm X was a criminal incarcerated in the system, but so too would be Martin Luther King Jr. Surprisingly, however, we have already covered X's only arrest. In the coming decades, King would be processed into the system at least 30 times. Of course, Malcolm hadn't been trying to join the ranks of the incarcerated. Civil disobedience broke the law in an attempt to draw attention to the injustice of the law. King hoped to have so many of his followers arrested that it would deprive the system of space to jail anyone else. Intense, nonviolent training challenged adherents of Dr. King to not respond to racial slurs spat into their faces, to remain sitting there while cops threatened to break their bones, to not abandon their post or message as the dogs were set loose and the fire hoses were being uncurled. He saw the path forward clearly, much clearer at least than Malcolm Little as he emerged from prison as a full-time employee for the Nation of Islam. Joseph notes that after prison, Malcolm wanted to make sense of his past. He crafted a narrative, later published in his autobiography, rooted in the truth as he remembered it. The memories that were most distressing revolved around his mistreatment of women. Detroit Red's romantic life, from the perspective of the newly reborn Malcolm X, was littered with emotionally abusive relationships. It was right there in prison, Malcolm recalled years later, that I made up my mind to devote the rest of my life to telling the white man about himself, or die. In his mind, this meant the revelation that America was the ongoing perpetrator of history's greatest crime, racial slavery. The FBI began to surveil him almost immediately. King was graduating in 1951, but rather than returning to Atlanta, he used the monetary scholarship that he earned as the school's valedictorian to attend Boston University, seeking a doctorate in the philosophy of religion. It was there that he would meet and fall in love with Coretta Scott, a classically trained singer. They married just 18 months after their first date. While X attempted to shed his womanizing ways via the teachings of the Nation of Islam, King continued to skirt the line of decency in his private affairs. Joseph notes that even as he cast harsh judgment on Daddy King's unrepentant capitalism and the moral evil that gripped much of the world, King personally reveled in the masculine privileges of his social class. He expected a sexual fidelity and loyalty from Coretta that he would never offer in exchange. It was a complicated relationship, and their early romance eventually flowered into a marriage that became an intellectual and political partnership that bound them in a whirlwind of experiences, public and private, that drew them closer with each passing year. King's extramarital affairs, along with suggestions that he was a communist, made up the bulk of the FBI's files on the civil rights icon. Although they never discussed them, Coretta was fully aware of her husband's indiscretions with other women, chalking them up to the pressure that her husband was under. It is in these little tidbits that one realizes how much damage the simplistic reading of King and X has to the truth. King is nonviolent, X is violent. King is the holy Christian preacher, while X is the criminal in a radical offshoot of Islam. King was the moral leader of the movement. X was the criminal. In 1954, MLK became the highest-paid black minister in Montgomery, Alabama. Malcolm X took over as the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem, and the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation is inherently unequal. Utilizing the Dahl test of Dr. Kenneth Clark, the court recognized that African American children were suffering subconsciously from a feeling of inferiority. In connecting it to the segregation of schools, the court's decision opened the door for challenging segregation everywhere. Unfortunately, it was only a court decision, mere words on the pages. Its subsequent demand to desegregate schools in Brown 2 with all deliberate speed was interpreted in the South as a process that would take decades, if not centuries. A year into establishing his life in Montgomery, Dr. King was elected the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association as a compromise candidate. The group's purpose was to win the Montgomery bus boycott that had been started after Rosa Parks, herself an active member of the city's chapter of the NAACP, had refused to be moved to the back of the bus. Rosa Parks has no regrets about taking the stand that she did, but she does have some regrets regarding how her moment has been taught. In the simplification of the Montgomery bus boycott, she laments more than anything else that they made her old. The city of Montgomery's bus system was exceptionally discriminatory. The white versus colored section of the bus wasn't split 50-50. Instead, the first 75% of the bus was deemed for white riders, while the back 25% of the bus was designed for African Americans. This was despite the fact that 80% of the city's bus ridership was black. Worse, racist bus drivers were known to collect black passengers' money in the front, force them to exit and go to the back entrance, only to close the doors and leave before they could get back on the bus. Even worse are the reports of black men, women, and children getting caught in the doors and dragged for blocks. Rosa Parks wasn't meant to be the test case. That honor went to another who folded beneath the pressures of white supremacists. Rosa's anger on that day was authentic, however. Rather than merely having her feet hurt, as is commonly recounted, Mrs. Parks states for the record that people always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. But that isn't true. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. It was a choice made in a moment, but it was a choice that would change the world. Asking black residents of the city to stay off the buses for one day, the Montgomery bus boycott lasted for 381 days. African Americans walked to where they needed to go, sometimes 10 to 20 miles away. Churches arranged ride shares. When the city made that practice illegal, black taxi drivers began charging the significantly reduced bus fee for rides. In 381 days, the city of Montgomery lost $3,000 each day running buses without passengers throughout the city. That staggering figure shows how difficult Dr. King's task was. While the boycott made him the national face of the modern civil rights movement, it took the city losing more than $700,000 to finally cave and allow black riders to sit where they wanted on the buses of just one southern city. Gradualism defined the difference between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. It was the same for their spiritual successors. Whereas King spent more than 1 year working to desegregate one transportation system in just one city, X demanded civil rights that ought to have been his at birth. To Martin Luther King Jr., the Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated something profound. Sustained, disciplined nonviolence could expose injustice so clearly that the conscience of the nation would be forced to respond. Speaking at the conclusion of the boycott in December 1956, King reminded supporters that their victory had not come through force, but through endurance. We have discovered, he said, that nonviolent resistance is not sterile passivity, but a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation. King's philosophy rested on a belief that American democracy, though deeply flawed, contained within it the mechanisms necessary for redemption. Change, in his view, required coalition building, legal victories, and moral persuasion directed not only at lawmakers, but at ordinary citizens who might yet be convinced to abandon segregation. It was the first battle in what would become a war, for as King proclaimed to a crowd of thousands, if democracy is to live, segregation must die. This patience was not accidental. King repeatedly warned against what he considered the dangers of reactionary anger. In his early sermons and speeches following Montgomery, he insisted, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Malcolm X saw the same events and drew nearly the opposite conclusion. From his position within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm argued that victories like Montgomery were celebrated precisely because they demanded so little structural change from white America. In a 1957 speech later circulated among Nation of Islam members, Malcolm mocked the idea that basic human rights should require prolonged negotiation. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches, he would later say, refining the metaphor in speeches throughout the early 1960s, and then pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. Whereas King interpreted gradual progress as evidence that nonviolence worked, Malcolm interpreted gradualism as proof that America only surrendered justice under pressure, and even then, reluctantly. In interviews during this period, Malcolm frequently contrasted what he calls civil rights with human rights. The first, he argued, confined the black freedom struggle within American courts controlled by the very government responsible for racial oppression. Human rights, by contrast, would place the issue before the world. Our problem, he stated in a televised interview, is not a civil rights problem. Our problem is a human rights problem. The distinction was critical. King sought inclusion within American democracy. Malcolm questioned whether that democracy possessed legitimacy in the first place. King appealed to the nation's founding documents. Malcolm appealed to its hypocrisies. King spoke the language of integration. Malcolm spoke the language of self-determination. And yet, both men rejected passivity, a point often lost in simplified classroom narratives. King's strategy demanded confrontation through mass protest, economic disruption, and deliberate civil disobedience. In fact, during Montgomery, he openly acknowledged the tension between patience and urgency, declaring freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Malcolm agreed entirely with the demand, just not with the timetable. To him, asking black Americans to wait for acceptance amounted to moral absurdity. "I'm not for waiting," he told audiences repeatedly. "I'm for doing whatever is necessary to bring about results now." Thus, by the late 1950s, two visions of liberation had begun to crystallize before the American public. One argued that justice could be achieved by awakening the conscience of the nation. The other argued that justice would only come when black Americans stopped asking for it altogether. Both men claimed urgency. They simply disagreed on whether America deserved their patience. King spent years trying to jumpstart a nationwide movement after the Montgomery bus boycott. This included traveling to both Ghana and London. It also involved him desperately seeking a White House meeting with President Eisenhower. King knew in his heart that black civil rights advocates needed white allies, something that again separated him from the philosophy of Malcolm X, who was just beginning to emerge as a nationwide civil rights leader. When X left prison in 1952, the Nation of Islam counted only a few hundred members nationwide. By the early 1960s, that number had grown into the tens of thousands, and much of that expansion could be traced directly to one man. Assigned to Mosque Number 7 in Harlem, Malcolm demonstrated a rare ability to translate the nation's theology into political language that resonated with northern black audiences living far from the southern battlegrounds of desegregation. Unlike King, Malcolm did not emerge through a single dramatic protest. His rise came through speeches, hundreds of them delivered in storefront temples, on street corners, college campuses, and eventually national television. Journalists who arrived expecting an extremist often left describing a speaker of unsettling intelligence and discipline. Mike Wallace remarked after a 1959 television documentary that Malcolm possessed an extraordinary command of language and argument, even as critics condemned his conclusions. Malcolm's message began with a premise fundamentally different from King's. The central problem facing black Americans was not merely segregation, but dependence. Integration, he argued, risked becoming a psychological trap if it required black Americans to seek validation from white society. "We don't want integration," Malcolm declared in numerous early speeches. "We want recognition as human beings." This distinction shaped his views on white allies, perhaps the clearest dividing line between him and King during this period. King believed interracial cooperation was both morally necessary and strategically essential. The Montgomery bus boycott had succeeded in part because sympathetic white citizens, religious leaders, journalists, and eventually federal courts became participants in the struggle. King consistently framed civil rights as a test of American democracy itself, appealing to white moderates as potential partners in redemption. Malcolm rejected that premise outright. In speech after speech, he warned black audiences against placing their freedom in white hands. The white man is not sincere in his support, he argued during early lectures. To Malcolm, alliances too easily became mechanisms of control, moderating black demands to preserve white comfort. The philosophical divide became unmistakable in 1963, the year both men reached new levels of national visibility. That August, more than 200,000 Americans gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Organized by a broad coalition of civil rights leaders, labor activists, and religious organizations, the march represented the high-water mark of interracial cooperation within the civil rights movement. It culminated with King's "I Have a Dream" speech, a moment widely celebrated as a moral triumph. But Malcolm X saw something very different. In interviews later that year, he famously dismissed the demonstration as the farce on Washington. Speaking in Detroit in November 1963, Malcolm argued that the march had begun as a genuine expression of black anger, but had been neutralized through white political influence. It was the grassroots out there in the streets, he said, and the white man joined it, took it over, and changed it from an angry revolution to a picnic. According to Malcolm, the presence of white allies and federal oversight transformed protest into performance. It was a farce pretending to be important. MLK, by this point, had literally turned himself into a comic book character in his attempt to expand the message. The government, he claimed, permitted the march precisely because it posed no real threat to existing power structures. By allowing symbolic expression, authorities could declare progress while avoiding deeper economic and structural reforms. Where King saw proof that America's conscience could awaken, Malcolm saw proof that America could absorb dissent without changing. This critique reached its fullest expression the following year in one of Malcolm X's most important speeches, The Ballot or the Bullet, delivered in April 1964. By this time, Malcolm had begun distancing himself from the Nation of Islam, but the speech captured the culmination of his political philosophy. Addressing audiences in Cleveland and Detroit, Malcolm reframed the struggle not as a moral appeal, but as a question of political power. It'll be ballots, he warned, or it'll be bullets. It'll be liberty, or it'll be death. The line was not a call for violence in the simplistic way critics often portray it. Rather, Malcolm argued that black Americans must leverage their voting power strategically and independently, refusing automatic loyalty to either political party. A ballot, he explained, is like a bullet. You don't throw your ballot until you see a target. Likewise, he didn't mind nonviolence, as long as the side that he was against was also practicing nonviolence. To him, only a chump sat there to get beaten. He regularly criticized both Democrats and Republicans for courting black voters without delivering meaningful change, insisting that political independence, not interracial goodwill, would force genuine concessions. King, meanwhile, continued to believe that moral coalition building could reshape the nation. In speeches throughout 1963 and 64, he emphasized shared destiny, declaring, "We are caught in an inescapable network together, tied in a single garment of destiny." To King, white allies were evidence that America could evolve. To Malcolm, reliance on white allies risked diluting black autonomy. Yet beneath their disagreement laid a shared observation. Federal action only followed sustained pressure. King applied pressure through nonviolent mass protests designed to win sympathy. Malcolm applied pressure through rhetoric that made white America fear the alternative to nonviolence. In this sense, though neither would have admitted it publicly at the time, their approaches functioned almost as opposing halves of the same political force. King made reconciliation imaginable. Malcolm made delay dangerous. And together, intentionally or not, they expanded the boundaries of what America believed the civil rights movement was demanding. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X had become the public face of the Nation of Islam, a tireless organizer, brilliant orator, and symbol of black empowerment for thousands of northern African Americans. To those who watched him speak in Harlem storefronts, college auditoriums, and television studios, Malcolm's energy seemed inexhaustible. But behind the public persona lay a private storm. The growing realization that the man he had revered above all others, Elijah Muhammad, was deeply flawed. This realization struck Malcolm on multiple levels. Elijah Muhammad had been a father figure to him, filling the void left by the violent death of his own dad and the institutionalization of his mother. From childhood, Malcolm had learned to equate moral authority with parental guidance. The absence of his father had left an almost sacred need for mentorship. In Muhammad, he had found a spiritual and paternal anchor, a man who disciplined, taught, and inspired. Yet Malcolm could not ignore what he saw with his own eyes. By the early 1960s, whispers about Muhammad's extramarital relationships and his handling of organizational finances became impossible to dismiss. In the autobiography of Malcolm X, Malcolm recounts learning of Muhammad's affairs with women in the community he led, taking advantage of the sheep that trusted him in his flock. To Malcolm, this was not merely hypocrisy. It was a moral betrayal of the highest order. He wrote, "Here was a man who taught us to be pure, disciplined, and righteous, yet he himself was breaking the very laws he claimed were divine." Financial concerns compounded the personal betrayal. Malcolm had devoted years of his life to traveling, recruiting, organizing, and fundraising, often representing the nation in front of media, church groups, and potential donors. Yet he observed opaque accounting practices, questions about how contributions were being allocated, and a lack of transparency from the leadership. For a man whose worldview demanded integrity, discipline, and accountability, this contradiction became intolerable. The personal nature of the betrayal cannot be overstated. Malcolm had grown up with a father murdered, a mother institutionalized, and siblings scattered by welfare authorities. To see Elijah Muhammad, the man who stood in as both spiritual and paternal authority, violate the principles he preached felt like a reenactment of the abandonment he had suffered as a boy. It was both grief and moral outrage intertwined, a psychological echo of the trauma long unprocessed. By 1963 and 1964, the rupture had become inevitable. Malcolm began to question not only the leadership of the Nation of Islam, but the dogma itself. He publicly raised issues about financial accountability and the moral conduct of leaders, challenging the very structure he had once served unquestioningly. His letters and speeches from this period reveal a man grappling with both anger and clarity. "The truth is the truth," he wrote, "and no man, no matter how great, can be above it." The decision to leave the nation in March 1964 was therefore not merely political. It was intensely personal and ethical. Malcolm lost a platform, much of his community, and the surrogate father that had sustained him. Yet he also gained moral freedom, independence of thought, and the ability to pursue a broader understanding of human rights. This break opened the path for one of the most transformative periods of Malcolm's life, the Mecca pilgrimage, where he encountered Muslims of all races, worshiping together as equals. He later reflected, "Before I left, I had made the assumption that all white men were devils. But in Mecca, I saw whites who were sincere in faith and in justice. It made me realize that the struggle was not with people because of race. It was a system that perpetuated oppression." Here, the first philosophical convergence with King began to emerge. Although Malcolm had always rejected reliance on white allies, his experience in the Middle East and growing international perspective led him to reconsider the potential for interracial cooperation. King, by contrast, had consistently sought white participation in the movement, arguing that moral persuasion and coalition building could reshape the conscience of the nation. Malcolm began to see parallels in principle. He shared King's insistence on non-passivity, the urgency of political engagement, and the centrality of justice as a universal human right. He still rejected slow incrementalism, but he now acknowledged that genuine allies, whether white Americans in good faith or the international community, could amplify the fight against oppression. In letters and speeches in 64 and 65, he began emphasizing shared humanity, advocating for strategic coalitions while maintaining independence and insistence on self-respect. A synthesis of his former militancy with King's patient moral vision. Both men remained distinct. King's approach continued to prioritize nonviolent moral persuasion. Malcolm's emphasized self-determination, vigilance, and the necessity of challenging unjust systems directly. But now they were converging on a shared truth. The struggle for civil rights required both strategic patience and unflinching insistence on justice. King demonstrated how a nation could be moved by conscience. Malcolm demonstrated how the oppressed could demand change when that conscience failed. The convergence of these ideas, born of distinct experiences, created a new paradigm for civil rights leadership. For the first time, Malcolm's personal awakening and King's strategic victories revealed that the Black freedom struggle was not a monolith. It was a spectrum of approaches, each necessary, each informed by both the trauma of history and the moral imperative of the present. In this sense, the story of Malcolm X leaving the Nation of Islam, traveling to Mecca, and beginning to reframe his worldview was not just a personal evolution. It was a bridge, an intellectual and ethical link that would allow historians, activists, and students alike to see King and Malcolm not as opposites, but as complementary forces in the fight for justice. By late 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. had cemented his position as the nation's most prominent voice for civil rights. The passage of the Civil Rights Act in July of that year represented the culmination of years of painstaking work, marches, boycotts, sermons, and carefully crafted political alliances. It was a moment that validated King's philosophy of disciplined nonviolent protest, coalition building, and moral appeal to the nation. Looking back, it is impossible to overstate the significance of King's letter from Birmingham jail in '63. There, he framed the intellectual and ethical core of his activism. Written in response to white clergy who criticized his methods, King defended civil disobedience as both morally justifiable and necessary. "Justice too long delayed is justice denied," he famously wrote, and he outlined a philosophy that demanded action against injustice while simultaneously appealing to shared human morality. That letter would become a lodestar not only for the movement he led, but for activists of every stripe who followed. Meanwhile, Malcolm X was undergoing his own profound transformation. Freed from the confines of the Nation of Islam, he had embarked on the pilgrimage of Mecca, where he experienced a revelation that reshaped his understanding of race and coalition building. For the first time, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were moving towards one another philosophically. While their methods remained distinct, a subtle convergence of purpose began to emerge. Both men were increasingly concerned with systemic injustice, economic exploitation, and the moral imperative for immediate change. This convergence was echoed in the younger generation of activists, most notably Stokely Carmichael, then a rising leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. The group had been formed in 1960 as a student-led organization dedicated to nonviolent protest and voter registration drives across the South. Carmichael began as a disciple of King's philosophy, organizing sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives under strict adherence to nonviolent principles. Yet Carmichael's experiences, the repeated arrests, beatings, and slow pace of legislative progress drew him increasingly to Malcolm X's ideas. In his own words, the more you listen to Malcolm X, the more you realize that nonviolence is not enough. The system respects patience. It does not respect justice. This intellectual and moral shift marked the beginning of Carmichael's embrace of Black power, a concept he would define as the right of Black people to control their own political, economic, and social institutions, a stark departure from the incrementalism that King had often represented. Carmichael's embrace of Black power also foreshadowed his later role in shaping the Black Panther Party, an organization founded in 1966 to defend Black communities, provide social programs, and assert self-determination in the face of systemic oppression. While the Panthers were not simply an extension of Malcolm X, his insistence on autonomy, self-defense, and cultural pride had deeply influenced their ideology. Carmichael, directly inspired by X, adapted those ideas into a broader political framework, translating them into grassroots organizing and public rhetoric. This evolution mirrored the sentiment among many African Americans at the time. Across the North and South, communities increasingly refused to cast their bucket where they were, to accept the piecemeal, gradual reforms offered by moderate allies or the slow march of legislation. Instead, inspired by X, they demanded immediate recognition of their rights, economic independence, and control over their communities. Malcolm X himself articulated Black power as more than a slogan. In speeches from 64 and 65, he defined it as the right of Black people to determine their own destiny, the right to defend themselves by any means necessary, the right to control the politics, the economics, and the culture of their own communities. This was not merely a call to militancy, it was a call to autonomy and dignity. It acknowledged the failures of systems that had historically delayed justice and reframed the struggle from moral appeal to strategic empowerment. In this sense, Black power was both an evolution of Malcolm's earlier insistence on urgency and a radical complement to King's emphasis on moral persuasion. By the end of 1965, the American civil rights landscape had shifted dramatically. King's moral authority and legislative victories continued to inspire, while Malcolm X's ideas of self-determination, uncompromising advocacy, and strategic independence had ignited the imagination of younger activists and urban communities. Together, their influence created a dual pathway, one that combined patient coalition building with immediate self-directed empowerment, reflecting both the enduring hope of King's philosophy and the uncompromising demand for justice articulated by X. In essence, what had begun as two parallel struggles, one in the streets of Montgomery, the other in the temples and lecture halls of Harlem, were now interweaving into a broader, multi-generational civil rights strategy. King was learning to understand impatience as a legitimate response to oppression. Malcolm was learning to see the potential for principled alliances beyond race. In the next generation, Carmichael, the Panthers, and countless unnamed activists would synthesize these lessons into a movement that was both moral and militant, patient and urgent, local and global. Although the two men had begun to shift their way of thinking closer to each other, they never had the chance to sit down and have a real conversation. Even worse, the final similarity between the two men was how they passed from this earth, each taken before they had accomplished their mission. Malcolm X had long understood the danger he faced. After breaking with the Nation of Islam in March 1964, he received a steady stream of death threats. Former associates within the organization viewed him as a traitor. Extremists outside it saw him as a target. His visibility and his uncompromising advocacy for Black empowerment only heightened the risk. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X spoke to a packed audience at a ballroom in Manhattan. 3 gunmen rushed the stage and opened fire. Eyewitnesses reported chaos, chairs overturned, screams filling the room, and supporters desperately trying to shield him. Malcolm X was pronounced dead shortly afterwards at a nearby hospital. He was only 39 years old. The shock reverberated across the civil rights community. Martin Luther King Jr. publicly expressed profound grief and recognition of Malcolm's contributions, saying, "Malcolm X made a contribution to the awakening of our people. His voice reminded us of the urgency of justice, even if his methods were different. We cannot let his death silence the cry for freedom." King's words reflected a nuanced understanding. Malcolm had articulated frustrations and demands that King himself shared, even if they disagreed on the methods. In the years following Malcolm's death, King's activism expanded into broader arenas. He increasingly addressed issues of economic justice, planning the Poor People's Campaign to tackle systemic poverty across racial lines. He linked economic inequality to racial injustice, asserting that true civil rights required economic power as well as political rights. At the same time, King spoke out against the Vietnam War, connecting the oppression of black communities at home to the violence inflicted abroad. His April 1967 speech at Riverside Church in New York City famously called the war an enemy of the poor, highlighting the disproportionate burden borne by African Americans and the white working class. The political and social context of the late 1960s was volatile. 1968 became one of the most turbulent years in modern American history. President Lyndon B. Johnson withdrew from the re-election race, citing the impossibility of managing the war in Vietnam and domestic unrest. Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in June, further destabilizing the nation. Race riots erupted in urban centers, expressing accumulated frustration at systemic inequality, police brutality, and economic neglect. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into chaos, with police violently confronting anti-war and civil rights protesters, a vivid symbol of a nation at war with itself. Amid this chaos, King continued to advocate for justice to the last of his days. On April 4, 1968, while supporting striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, he was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Like Malcolm X, he was only in the prime of his activism, taken before he could fully realize his dream. His death triggered national mourning, yet also reinforced the urgency of the work he had championed. Central to understanding King's enduring influence is his "I Have a Dream" speech from August of '63. While the final dream section is widely celebrated, it is crucial to recognize the structure of the speech. The first portion catalogs injustice, systemic segregation, disenfranchisement, and the failures of American democracy. King confronts the harsh realities of oppression, making the speech as urgent as it is inspiring. The second portion, the dream, shifts to vision, hope, and aspiration. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. I have a dream that my 4 little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." This structure underscores a profound truth. The dream was not yet realized. It was and remains a vision passed on to future generations. In many ways, Malcolm X's radical urgency complements this dream. Where King cast a moral vision of the future, Malcolm demanded immediate action in the present. Together, they embody the full spectrum of struggle. Even in death, both men left a living legacy. King's moral clarity and eloquence continue to inspire peaceful protest and legislative advocacy. Malcolm X's insistence on black autonomy, political power, and cultural pride continues to influence activists who refuse incremental compromises and demand systemic justice. Their work converges in the idea that freedom, equality, and dignity are never fully granted. They must be claimed and defended by each generation. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every little bit of support helps. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.